Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling back through time to visit 7 of the most extraordinary creations the ancient world ever saw, the 7 wonders. From the towering Great Pyramid of Giza to the gleaming lighthouse of Alexandria, from the lush hanging gardens of Babylon to the majestic temple of Artemis, these wonders captured the imagination of everyone who saw them. But time, weather, and war have a way of changing the world, and most of these marvels have long since vanished. Tonight, we'll explore what they were, where they stood, and what became of them. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to learn, to relax, or simply to drift through the past, I'm glad you've joined me. Now let's begin. If you had been wandering along the banks of the Nile some 4,500 years ago, you might have looked up from your fishing net or your daydream and noticed that, just to the west, something rather impossible was taking shape. On the Giza Plateau, where the desert rises in a long, pale swell above the river, tens of thousands of workers were coaxing the earth into doing something it had never done before: grow a perfect mountain of stone. This was no casual weekend project. Their employer, Pharaoh Khufu, a man not given to understatement, had decided that his tomb should be a structure so magnificent that the gods would be able to see it without leaving their celestial armchairs. The ancient Egyptians were already accomplished builders, but this was another matter entirely. This was ambition pressed into limestone. The Great Pyramid began as an idea, perhaps sketched with a reed pen in the cool shade of the royal court, but it quickly became a logistical performance of staggering proportions. The raw material alone is hard to grasp. An estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing as much as the family car you never bought because you didn't think you needed one. These had to be quarried, transported, and placed with such precision that 4.5 millennia later, surveyors would still be scratching their heads at the accuracy. The sides of the pyramid are almost perfectly aligned to the cardinal points of the compass, deviating by mere minutes of arc. This was achieved without laser levels, without GPS, without even the comforting modern illusion of project management software. Just human ingenuity, patient measurement, and probably quite a lot of shouting. It wasn't all brute force, of course. The Egyptians understood the subtleties of stone in a way that would make most modern builders look like enthusiastic amateurs. The core blocks, a rougher limestone from nearby quarries, were stacked into the pyramid's bulk, while a layer of dazzling white Tura limestone casing stones, so precisely cut you could barely slip a knife blade between them, formed the gleaming skin. In the bright Egyptian sun, the pyramid must have shone like a beacon, so brilliant that it could be seen from many miles away, as if the horizon had been studded with a colossal jewel. And at its heart, somewhere deep in the cool silence of the interior, lay a series of chambers and passageways designed to protect Khufu in the afterlife. These corridors were not simply carved at whim, they were laid out with symbolic intent, aligning with certain stars and perhaps even serving as ceremonial avenues for the pharaoh's soul. The whole thing was part monument, part cosmic machine. Standing there during its construction, you would have been surrounded by a scene both mesmerizing and chaotic. Men dragging sledges up ramps, others chiseling blocks to the ring of copper tools, foremen shouting orders over the wind, and everywhere the rhythmic thud of stone meeting stone. The air would have been filled with dust, the smell of sweat and sun-baked limestone, and the low, ceaseless rumble of a project too big to stop. It was, quite simply, the largest and most precise object humans had ever made. And perhaps the most extraordinary part is that all this effort wasn't to defend a kingdom or house the living, but to give one man a dignified, glorious, and possibly eternal rest. It is one of the more remarkable facts about human civilization that the Great Pyramid of Giza has been standing for so long that the ancient Romans thought it was ancient. When Julius Caesar's troops camped near it in 48 BCE, the pyramid was already more than 2,000 years old, older to them than the Colosseum is to us. By then, it had already outlived the kings and dynasties that had ordered its creation, watched the rise and fall of entire empires, and seen the Nile flood and recede thousands of times. And yet there it stood, calm as a sleeping cat in the sun, as if time were merely a light breeze brushing its flanks. Even now, after 4,500 years of battering by wind, sand, earthquakes, looters, and tourists in baseball caps, it remains an object of almost arrogant persistence. The pyramid's survival is partly down to the astonishing stubbornness of its builders. You don't spend decades hauling millions of stones into place without taking a few measures to ensure the thing stays put. Each block was fitted so snugly to its neighbour that erosion has been more of a slow whisper than a shout. The foundations were cut deep into the bedrock, and the sheer mass of the structure, roughly 5.9 million tons of stone, means it sits as immovably as a mountain. This is the architectural equivalent of a creature too big for the predators to bother with. Unlike the delicate bronze skin of the Colossus of Rhodes or the earthquake-prone columns of the Temple of Artemis, the pyramid was a fortress in form and function. It didn't need upkeep so much as it needed to be left alone, which, for the most part, it was. That is not to say the pyramid emerged entirely unscathed from history's more chaotic chapters. For the first 2,000 years or so, it retained its original smooth limestone casing, which would have made it gleam blindingly in the Egyptian sun. But in the Middle Ages, Cairo was growing quickly, and stone is expensive to quarry, so opportunistic builders did what opportunistic builders have always done. They borrowed from what was already there. Layer by layer, the casing stones were pried away to become the walls and mosques of the city, leaving the rougher, stepped core exposed. This is why, today, the Great Pyramid looks a little like a weathered staircase with delusions of grandeur. If you peer closely near its base, though, you can still see a few surviving casing stones, tucked away like stubborn old teeth, reminding you of how dazzling the whole thing once was. What is perhaps most extraordinary about the pyramid's long life is how adaptable it has been to the whims of the ages. Over time, it has been a tomb, a curiosity, a quarry, a scientific puzzle, a stage for romantic poetry, a backdrop for imperial photographs, a nationalist symbol, and now, of course, a tourist attraction. Napoleon is said to have stood before it and calculated in his head how many men it would take to build such a thing. The answer, he decided, was more than France currently has available. In the 19th century, British surveyors came to measure it with such obsessive precision that they argued for months over fractions of an inch, convinced that Khufu's masons had embedded secret units of cosmic measurement into its geometry. More recently, teams with ground-penetrating radar have scanned its hidden chambers, searching for new mysteries. Every century seems to find its own reason to stare up at the pyramid and wonder how, why, or whether it's possible to get a better photograph without all those other tourists in the way. And so, the pyramid has endured, not in the protected, museum-like way we usually preserve ancient artifacts, but as a thing simply too vast and too solid to go away. It's the only one of the seven wonders that still stands in anything like its original form, and it's hard not to imagine it feeling, in some quiet, geological way, a bit smug about that. The hanging gardens are dust, the lighthouse is gone, Zeus has long since been melted down, but Khufu's tomb remains, impervious to fashion, famine, or fundamental change. It doesn't care who is looking at it, Persian general, Victorian adventurer, or a busload of German retirees. It will be here long after they've all moved on. It is, in other words, the closest thing we have to proof that a human idea can be made immortal if you build it big enough, heavy enough, and with just the right blend of ambition and obsessive precision. The trouble with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is that they may never have existed, which, for a wonder of the world, is a bit of an administrative problem. All the others, for all their collapses and crumblings, left at least some scraps behind: blocks of stone, a toppled column, a broken lion paw, something to point at and say, yes, there you see, that was it. The Hanging Gardens, by contrast, have left us nothing. Not a flower pot, not a cracked irrigation pipe, not even a sign that says, closed for repairs. And yet they persist in our imagination with a vividness that makes them almost tangible. In every retelling, they are lush, tiered, improbably green, a little slice of paradise improbably hoisted into the dry, sun-blasted air of Mesopotamia. That they remain so fixed in the human mind, without a shred of solid evidence, says a great deal about the power of a good story, and perhaps a little about our fondness for gardens we don't have to water ourselves. The story, as it has come down to us, begins in Babylon, sometime around the year 600 BCE, in the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II, a man with a name so long and sonorous you have to resist the urge to roll it around in your mouth a few times before saying anything else. Nebuchadnezzar was not just another monarch. He was the sort of ruler who liked his projects big, showy, and impossible to ignore. He rebuilt Babylon's walls to such thickness that 2 chariots could race along the top side by side. He restored temples, constructed massive gates, and generally turned the city into the sort of place you could brag about at diplomatic dinners. But the crown jewel, according to later writers, was not a fortress or a temple, but a gift, a lavish living sculpture of terraces, trees, and flowers built for his queen, Amytis. She was from the green, mountainous land of Media to the north, and the endless flat brown horizon of Babylon was not to her taste. So Nebuchadnezzar, in a gesture that surely must have caused headaches for his engineers, decided to give her a mountain in the middle of the desert. What they apparently produced was a kind of stepped pyramid of gardens, a stack of stone terraces rising one above the other, each planted with such abundance that the whole thing looked from a distance as if a forest were floating above the city walls. The idea alone is magnificent. Shade trees arching over paved walkways, vines tumbling down over parapets, the scent of jasmine drifting in the hot air. Imagine the green spilling over the edges in a city otherwise ruled by the colour of baked clay. But the genius wasn't only aesthetic, it was logistical. To keep so much vegetation alive in the Babylonian sun required an irrigation system of baffling sophistication. Ancient accounts speak of water being drawn up from the Euphrates River by some sort of continuous chain or screw pump, and then distributed across the terraces through channels and cisterns. This was 2,000 years before anyone in Europe thought of pumping water uphill for anything other than survival. It is one of those rare examples where ancient engineering seems to leap forward in time, like finding a Victorian telephone in a Viking longhouse. If it all sounds too good to be true, well, that's the difficulty. The Hanging Gardens are curiously absent from the writings of Herodotus, who was otherwise rather thorough in noting Babylon's marvels. The earliest detailed descriptions we have come from Greek historians like Strabo and Diodorus, writing several centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's time. They speak of the terraces, the great stone vaults that supported them, the lushness of the plants, but they do so in a tone that suggests they never actually saw them. In fact, there's a growing suspicion among scholars that the gardens may not have been in Babylon at all. One persuasive theory holds that they were actually built hundreds of miles to the north, in Nineveh, by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who certainly had both the resources and the documented irrigation systems to pull it off. Somewhere along the line, the story may have been moved south and given a Babylonian coat of paint, either by Greek writers who didn't know the difference, or by storytellers who simply liked the sound of Hanging Gardens of Babylon better than the more geographically accurate Hanging Gardens of Nineveh. Whatever the truth, the garden's image, real or imagined, was irresistible to the ancient world. There is something inherently captivating about the idea of a garden that defies its environment, that takes the raw, inhospitable reality of a desert and overlays it with greenery. In a way, it's an ancient version of a fantasy we still hold. The rooftop garden in a skyscraper city, the glass house in the middle of winter, the green wall in a concrete square. The hanging gardens appeal because they are not merely beautiful, they are improbable. And perhaps that improbability is precisely why the story has endured. When you can't be certain something ever existed, your imagination is free to make it as wondrous as you like. If the hanging gardens did exist, and I know we are starting to sound like we're qualifying every sentence here, it is almost certain they would not have lasted forever. Even the most carefully built marvels are ultimately no match for the combined forces of time, climate, and human interference. Ancient Mesopotamia was an industrious place, but it was also prone to all the usual inconveniences: political upheaval, unpredictable weather, shifting rivers, and worst of all, earthquakes. This was a region that sat uncomfortably near the tectonic fringes, and the soil beneath Babylon was not the sort to offer steadfast support to anything heavy, let alone a series of terraces groaning under the weight of trees, water, and soil. If the accounts of the gardens are true, then at some point between their supposed construction in the 6th century BCE and the first few centuries CE, an earthquake or several earthquakes would have made short work of the whole arrangement. Massive stone vaults could crack. The fine channels carrying water to the highest terraces could be knocked out of alignment, leaving the plants above to wither in the sun. And unlike the Great Pyramid, which could simply shrug off a tremor, a garden is a living thing. Stop tending it for even a short while, and it quickly turns from a marvel to an eyesore. Then there is the simple matter of maintenance. A project of such scale would have required constant attention. Gardeners to prune, replace and replant, engineers to maintain the irrigation machinery, masons to check the stonework for cracks and erosion, and laborers to keep the whole intricate system moving. As long as a powerful, well-funded ruler was around to keep the wages paid and the machinery of care humming along, the gardens could be sustained. But once the political winds shifted, once the treasuries thinned, or the royal eye wandered to other projects, the gardens would have been perilously vulnerable to neglect. One season of failed irrigation could turn a lush terrace into a dusty balcony. One hot, dry summer could undo decades of planting. The Mesopotamian sun has never been particularly forgiving to those who underestimate it. All of this, of course, is speculation. And the problem with the hanging gardens, what makes them the most tantalizing and maddening of all the wonders, is that we have to do most of our talking about them in the conditional tense. We say, if they existed, far more than we say, when they stood here. Archaeologists have scoured Babylon and found plenty of impressive remains, massive walls, gates, temples, but no definitive sign of the gardens. No identifiable terrace foundations, No irrigation systems of the sort described in Greek accounts. Nothing that could say with certainty, yes, here. This is where Nebuchadnezzar indulged his queen with a small mountain of imported greenery. The only thing Babylon offers in this regard is silence, and a silence that stretches uncomfortably across the centuries. This is why the Nineveh theory has such appeal. Excavations there have uncovered traces of vast, complex aqueducts built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib in the early 7th century BCE, complete with stone channels and inscriptions bragging about his skill in bringing water to the city. Some scholars have suggested that the Greeks, encountering accounts of Sennacherib's feats long after the fact, simply relocated them to the more famous and more exotic-sounding Babylon. This sort of geographical and chronological muddling was not uncommon in ancient storytelling. The past was often edited for narrative neatness rather than factual accuracy. The result is that we might, in fact, be crediting the wrong king in the wrong city for the wrong garden. And yet, because Babylon carries a certain mythic weight in the Western imagination, the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh has never quite caught on. It doesn't sing in the same way. The absence of physical remains has also allowed the gardens to exist in a sort of narrative limbo, where each generation can imagine them afresh. In some retellings, they are a dense tropical forest, dripping with orchids and strangler figs. In others, they are stately rows of cypresses and palms shading tiled walkways. In still others, they are an elaborate tangle of fruit trees, grapevines and flower beds, all orchestrated to bloom in harmonious bursts of colour. Without archaeological evidence to rein in these visions, the gardens have become the most personal of the wonders. Each historian, artist, and novelist crafting their own Babylon in the sky. They have appeared in medieval manuscripts, romantic poetry, early 20th century travel posters, and countless modern video games, all looking slightly different, all equally confident in their authenticity. It is as if everyone feels entitled to plant a little of themselves in those terraces. Without archaeological evidence to rein in these visions, the gardens have become the most personal of the wonders. Each historian, artist, and novelist crafting their own Babylon in the sky. They have appeared in medieval manuscripts, romantic poetry, early 20th century travel posters, and countless modern video games, all looking slightly different, all equally confident in their authenticity. It is as if everyone feels entitled to plant a little of themselves in those terraces. And perhaps that is the real secret of their endurance. They are not pinned down by facts. Where the Great Pyramid is an immovable object, solid and definite, and incapable of being anything other than what it is, the Hanging Gardens are infinitely adaptable. They are a canvas for longing. They speak to something in us that wants to believe that beauty can be conjured out of the least likely circumstances, that a parched, dusty city could hold within its walls a cool, green sanctuary. Whether they were real bricks and mortar or nothing more than an exquisite misunderstanding, they have left a more vivid picture in our cultural memory than many things we know for certain existed, which, if you think about it, is a rather marvelous trick in itself. If you had wandered into Olympia in the middle of the 5th century BCE, you might have been forgiven for thinking that the Greeks had discovered a way to make a god sit still for a portrait. Olympia was not a city, not in the sense of Athens or Corinth, but a sanctuary, a patch of sacred land along the Alpheus River, dotted with temples and training grounds, and thick with the scent of olive trees and ambition. It was here, every 4 years, that the most important sporting event in the Greek world unfolded: the Olympic Games. Athletes arrived from every corner of the Hellenic world, not for cash prizes, there weren't any, but for glory, olive wreaths, and the sort of immortality only Greek poets could bestow. And presiding over it all, at least in the minds of the faithful, was Zeus, the father of gods and men, watching from his lofty home on Mount Olympus. The Greeks, being Greeks, were not content to imagine Zeus up there in the clouds. They wanted him here, in stone and gold and ivory, in the middle of his own grand temple at Olympia. And so, sometime around 435 BCE, the city elders did the sensible thing. They hired Phidias. If you were looking for someone to bring a god convincingly to life, Phidias was your man. He had already made his name, and quite a reputation, over in Athens, where he had supervised the sculptural program of the Parthenon and produced a monumental statue of Athena that people were still talking about decades later. He was, in short, the closest thing the Greek world had to a celebrity sculptor, and when he accepted the commission to carve Zeus, it was the ancient equivalent of landing Spielberg for your documentary. What Phidias set about creating was no modest temple ornament. The statue of Zeus would be colossal, not in the loose modern sense of rather large, but in the sense that the word was meant to be used before over-enthusiastic real estate agents got hold of it. Zeus would sit enthroned inside the temple of Zeus, his head nearly brushing the cedar beams of the roof, so that anyone entering the temple would be struck first by his size, and then by the overwhelming feeling that they were standing in the presence of the divine. He was made using the chryselephantine technique, a delightful term that translates literally to gold and ivory, but which really meant this is going to cost more than the temple itself. His flesh, face, arms, feet was made from plates of ivory, polished to a smooth, warm luster, while his robe and ornaments were hammered from thin sheets of gold, the sort that catch fire in the lamplight. Every detail was calculated to impress. Zeus's throne was carved of cedar wood, inlaid with ebony and ivory, and decorated with precious stones and miniature sculptures. On his right hand, he held a small figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, herself rendered in exquisite detail, and in his left he grasped a scepter topped with an eagle, as if to remind visitors that the skies belonged to him. Beneath his feet rested a footstool supported by golden lions, because even a god, apparently, enjoys a place to rest his heels. Around the base of the statue, and on the throne's panels, scenes from Greek mythology played out in miniature. Amazon warriors clashing with Greeks, gods conversing with mortals, horses rearing mid-gallop. It was a feast for the eyes, a concentration of all the skill, patience, and artistry the Greek world could muster at the time. Stepping into the temple must have been an overwhelming experience. The interior was lit only by the faint daylight filtering through the doorway and the flickering glow of oil lamps, so that Zeus seemed to emerge from the shadows in stages. First the gold catching the light, then the ivory skin appearing out of the gloom, then, finally, the immensity of his whole seated form revealed as your eyes adjusted. Visitors would have had to crane their necks to take him in fully. Even the tallest of men could not have reached his chin. Contemporary accounts suggest that the effect was not just awe-inspiring, but slightly unnerving, as though Zeus might stand at any moment and crush the roof on his way out. It is worth noting that Olympia was not an easy place to build something like this. The sanctuary lay a good distance from the major centers of sculpture and materials, so everything, from the cedar for the throne to the ivory plates, had to be brought in with care. The ivory itself, imported from as far as Africa or India, had to be soaked, softened, cut, and fitted with astonishing precision to the wooden framework beneath. Gold had to be beaten into whisper-thin sheets and then carefully attached without tearing or buckling. All of it required specialized craftsmen, months of labor, and the kind of coordination that might make a modern project manager weep into his spreadsheets. And yet Phidias somehow made it look effortless. What he created became, almost immediately, a point of pilgrimage. People came to Olympia for the games, yes, but also for the privilege of standing before Zeus. Athletes sought his favor, poets described his splendor, statesmen and generals left offerings in his shadow. For those who had grown up with the myths, to see Zeus rendered so perfectly, stern yet serene, vast yet human, was to step for a moment into the stories themselves. And for the less pious, it was simply the finest work of art they had ever seen. There is a charming observation by the geographer Strabo, written centuries later, that anyone who saw the statue forgot everything else, which is as good a review as any artist could hope for. In the end, Phidias gave the Greeks exactly what they wanted. Not just a likeness of their god, but a space where human craftsmanship and divine grandeur seemed to meet halfway. It was art as devotion, architecture as spectacle, and the sort of thing that made the Seven Wonders list seem entirely justified. And as with so many such creations, its magnificence was matched only by the fragility of its existence. But that, as you might expect, is another part of the story. For nearly 1,000 years, the statue of Zeus at Olympia sat in serene splendor, a fixture as dependable as the rising of the sun or the arrival of the Olympic Games. Generations came and went, city-states rose, fought wars, fell, and were forgotten. Empires absorbed Greece and were themselves absorbed by others. But Zeus stayed put, gazing straight ahead with that calm, faintly amused expression that only gods and very old men seem able to perfect. He must have seen more than his fair share of human pageantry, the athletes parading in for the games, priests carrying offerings, philosophers wandering in to argue about metaphysics in the shadow of his sandals, perhaps the occasional Roman tourist craning his neck and muttering in Latin about the craftsmanship. It's tempting to think of the statue as indestructible, in part because that's how the Greeks intended him to look. Chryselephantine statues, the gold and ivory masterpieces of the ancient world, were the Rolls-Royces of religious art. But in reality, Zeus was, for all his magnificence, a delicate creature. Ivory is organic. Gold, for all its beauty, is thin and pliable when beaten into sheets. The wooden framework holding it all together was susceptible to humidity, insects, and the slow, relentless creep of time. Even in Olympia's relatively gentle climate, keeping a statue like that in top condition would have required constant, almost obsessive maintenance. By the Roman period, the Games had lost some of their original luster, and with them the steady flow of funds and care that had kept the statue pristine. Still, it endured. Roman emperors, who were generally not shy about helping themselves to Greek art, left Zeus where he was, perhaps out of reverence, or perhaps because moving a 40-foot god without snapping him in half was an engineering challenge even they weren't eager to take on. Eventually, though, history caught up. In the 4th century CE, as Christianity spread across the empire and pagan sanctuaries were shut down, Olympia's religious life came to an end. The temple was closed. The question then became, what do you do with a giant gold and ivory idol when its worshippers are gone? One version of events, and the one that seems to have caught the public imagination, has the statue being carefully dismantled and transported to Constantinople, the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and a place that collected fine works of art the way some people collect fridge magnets. There, in the Palace of Lausus, it supposedly stood among other pagan masterpieces, admired by a different kind of audience. If this account is true, it was a lucky reprieve, but only for a short while. In AD 475, a catastrophic fire ripped through the palace, and Zeus, along with everything else combustible and meltable in the vicinity, was destroyed. Gold can survive a lot, But ivory turns to ash in an instant, and the cedar frame would have gone up like a torch. Within a few hours, the greatest statue of the ancient Greek world was nothing but smoke and molten fragments. Another tradition insists that the statue never left Olympia at all, that it stayed in its temple until an earthquake, or perhaps a fire, brought the roof down and crushed it. This version has a melancholy appeal, as though Zeus chose to die in his own house rather than be carted off to adorn someone else's. The trouble is, both stories come to us through the thick, fogged glass of late antiquity, when people were already writing about the statue in the past tense. We can't say for certain which fate is true, or whether both are partially true in that muddled way history sometimes works. The only thing we can say with confidence is that by the late 5th century, Zeus was gone. What's especially frustrating is how completely he vanished. The Great Pyramid, stripped of its outer casing, is still unmistakably itself. The ruins of the Temple of Artemis still give you some sense of scale and splendor. Even the lighthouse of Alexandria left its bones in the harbor. But Zeus, 40 feet of gold, ivory, cedar, and genius, left nothing. Not a scrap of ivory, not a panel from the throne, not even the wooden frame. The temple still stands in outline, its columns toppled in neat rows like discarded pencils. But the great god who once filled its interior is absent. All we have are coins with tiny seated figures, sketches made centuries later by people who never saw the original, and written descriptions that range from sober architectural notes to florid poetry about how Zeus seemed so real you half expected him to speak. And yet, for something so completely gone, the statue's afterlife has been unusually robust. Artists in the Renaissance tried to imagine it, using their knowledge of Greek proportions and a bit of creative license, producing paintings and engravings that still influence how we picture it today. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., though no one will admit it officially, bears an uncanny resemblance to Phidias's Zeus, right down to the giant seated figure in a columned hall, gazing ahead with an expression that manages to be both commanding and oddly relaxed. Even in fiction, the statue's reputation lingers. It's the archetype of the throne-bound god, an image so deeply lodged in the cultural mind that it feels almost like a memory, even for people who never learned its name. In the end, the story of Zeus at Olympia is as much about impermanence as it is about glory. Here was an object built to embody eternity, to make the god visible to mortals for all time, and it lasted, depending on which account you believe, less than 1,000 years, which in the grand sweep of history is impressive, but also strangely fragile. And yet, in the way of the very best works of art, it seems not to matter that the thing itself is gone. The image remains, lodged in the imagination, shining just as brightly as it did when the oil lamps of Olympia first lit up the gold and ivory skin of a god. If you were a traveler in the Eastern Aegean during the middle of the 6th century BCE, there is a fair chance someone would have told you, probably more than once, that you absolutely must see the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Not should see, not might like to see, must. People in the ancient world did not toss around must-see recommendations lightly. Journeys were expensive, often perilous, and could involve days or weeks of bumping along in a creaky ox cart or bobbing miserably in a ship that smelled strongly of fish and regret. So when word spread that there was a temple in Asia Minor unlike anything else in the known world, it meant something. Ephesus itself was already a prosperous place, a port city in what is now western Turkey, sitting comfortably at the mouth of the Cayster River. It had been there for centuries, shifting under various rulers, but it was during the reign of the Lydian king Croesus, he of the rich as Croesus fame, that the city undertook its most ambitious project, a temple for Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, and, depending on which part of her job description you emphasized, fertility. The Greeks and their neighbors were never short of gods to worship, but Artemis was a major deity, one of those figures who managed to be both local and pan-Hellenic at the same time, beloved from the hills of Arcadia to the markets of Smyrna. She was a goddess you wanted on your side, and Ephesus was determined to prove they were her most devoted clients. And so, under the guidance of the architect Chersiphron and his son Metagenes, the Ephesians began to build not just a temple, but the temple, an edifice so large, so gleaming, so absolutely excessive in scale that it would make even the most jaded traveler stop and gape. The entire thing was made of marble, walls, columns, steps, even the roof tiles in places. The site itself had been carefully chosen on the flat ground outside the city walls, partly for space and partly because it was near a sacred grove where Artemis was already worshipped. The dimensions were staggering, roughly 137 meters long by 69 meters wide, larger in footprint than a modern football field, with 127 Ionic columns, each 18 meters tall, standing in perfect rows around the perimeter. In an age when most temples were sturdy but modest affairs, this was like building the Louvre in a world of garden sheds. But it wasn't just the size that stunned people, it was the detail. The columns were fluted, each groove catching the Mediterranean light in a way that made the whole forest of marble seem almost alive. Sculptors carved scenes of gods, heroes, and mythic beasts into the pediments and friezes. The interior was no less lavish, walls adorned with paintings, altars inlaid with gold and precious stones, and, at the center, the cult statue of Artemis herself, a many-breasted figure to signify fertility, though the precise symbolism is still debated, dressed in intricate robes and standing with a serene, slightly otherworldly expression. This was not just a building, it was a statement of wealth, piety, and civic pride on a scale few cities could even dream of. The effect on visitors was immediate and lasting. Ancient travel writers, not usually prone to understatement, regularly declared it one of the most beautiful things they had ever seen. Pilgrims came from across the Aegean and beyond to pay homage, to make offerings, to stand in the cool shade of the marble colonnades and feel, for a moment, that they were in the direct presence of the divine. Merchants loved it too. Any great religious destination has always been good for business. Stalls and workshops sprung up around the sanctuary, selling everything from votive figurines and amulets to bread, wine, and fresh fruit. Festivals honoring Artemis filled the city with music, dance, and athletic contests. In a world where religion and daily life were inextricable, the Temple of Artemis was not just a sacred space, but the beating heart of the Ephesian economy. And here is the thing. For all its grandeur, the temple was also an expression of something deeply human. You can feel in its design the urge to make something permanent, something that would outlast the people who built it. The Ephesians poured their resources into a monument that they must have imagined would stand for centuries, perhaps forever, as a declaration of their devotion and their place in the world. That is what makes the Temple of Artemis so compelling even in memory. It was not just a feat of engineering or a triumph of aesthetics, but a physical manifestation of collective belief, chiseled into marble with a confidence that now, looking back, feels almost heartbreakingly optimistic. For all its magnificence, and it really was the sort of building that could make your average traveler's jaw drop open and stay there, the Temple of Artemis was destined, like so many of the wonders, to have a relationship with history that could best be described as brief and complicated. The first great disaster came in 356 BCE, on a night that later storytellers would gleefully tie to one of antiquity's most famous birthdays, that of Alexander the Great. According to the legend, Artemis was so busy attending to the birth of the future conqueror in far-off Macedonia that she failed to protect her own temple in Ephesus. It's a pleasingly tidy narrative, the sort of poetic symmetry ancient chroniclers adored, though the more prosaic truth is that the destruction had nothing to do with divine maternity leave, and everything to do with one man's spectacularly selfish desire for immortality. That man was Herostratus, and if you have never heard of him, it is not for lack of his trying. Herostratus was, by all accounts, an unremarkable figure in most respects, neither noble nor wealthy, neither poet nor warrior, except for one powerful and rather pathological ambition. He wanted his name to live forever. The method he chose was as simple as it was appalling. Under cover of night, he set fire to the temple of Artemis, watching as the cedar beams and painted ceilings caught, and the flames raced upward into the marble colonnades. By morning, the grandest building in the known world was a smouldering ruin, and Herostratus had achieved his goal. Sort of. The Ephesians, in an admirable early attempt at reputation control, promptly arrested him, tortured him for a confession, executed him, and then issued a decree forbidding anyone to mention his name again, ever, on pain of death. It was, unfortunately, a policy doomed to fail. Greek historians, who were nothing if not incorrigible gossips, wrote down his name anyway, making him one of the very few people in history to achieve immortality purely through destruction. Today, herostratic fame is still a term for notoriety won by an act of vandalism. If there is any small consolation, it is that his life's achievement has been reduced to a cautionary footnote in the very story of the temple he destroyed. The people of Ephesus, however, were not ones to wallow. With funds from Alexander the Great, now a grown man and rather keen to put his stamp on history in a less incendiary fashion, they resolved to rebuild the temple, bigger and grander than before. The new structure rose on the same site, retaining the basic footprint of its predecessor, but enhancing nearly everything. Taller columns, more elaborate carvings, and an even more sumptuous array of artworks inside. For a while, it must have seemed that they had beaten the odds, that Ephesus's devotion to Artemis, backed by their architectural prowess, could outlast even the most determined arsonist. But the second life of the temple was not destined to be peaceful. The Roman Empire absorbed Ephesus, and for a time, the temple flourished as both a religious and a civic center. Pilgrims continued to arrive, merchants continued to profit. Then, in 262 CE, disaster struck again, not from within, but from without. A roving Gothic army swept through Asia Minor in one of those chaotic episodes of late antiquity, when central authority wobbled and borderlands dissolved into opportunity for the opportunistic. The Goths, as visiting armies tend to do, plundered whatever was worth taking and destroyed much of the rest. The Temple of Artemis, for all its beauty, was no match for the simple efficiency of fire and looting. Statues were toppled, treasures carted off, columns smashed or left cracked beyond repair. The sanctuary, once the pride of Ephesus, became a hollowed-out shell. The final blow came not with fire or sword, but with time and shifting beliefs. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had become the dominant religion of the empire, and pagan temples were increasingly seen as relics of an outdated, even dangerous past. The cult of Artemis dwindled, maintenance ceased, stones were quietly removed to be used in other buildings. Some may have gone into nearby churches, others, according to long-standing rumor, ended up in the walls of the great Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. By the time the city's harbour silted up and Ephesus itself fell into decline, the temple had already been reduced to little more than a memory and a scattering of broken marble. When European travellers in the Renaissance began seeking out the sites of the ancient wonders, Ephesus offered almost nothing to see. It wasn't until the 19th century that serious archaeological excavation began, led by British engineer John Turtle Wood. After years of digging and more than a few false starts, he finally located the temple's foundations in 1869, buried beneath centuries of accumulated earth. What he found was hardly the resplendent sanctuary of ancient accounts. Just a few column bases, scattered sculptural fragments, and the faint outline of the massive platform. A handful of surviving pieces made their way to the British Museum, where they can still be seen today. At the site itself, the modern visitor is greeted not by a forest of marble columns, but by one solitary reconstruction, an assembled column cobbled together from fragments found in the area. It rises incongruously from a marshy field, surrounded by reeds and often topped in the warmer months by a large stork's nest. There is something both poignant and oddly satisfying about this. Here, in the place where once stood one of the most admired buildings on Earth, nature has reclaimed the space so completely that the only permanent resident is a bird. It is a reminder, if you needed one, that all human splendor eventually yields to something else, whether it's fire, pillage, changing faith, or simply the patient, unhurried hand of time. Every so often in history, you come across a story that, even before you know all the details, feels destined to be grand. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus is one of those stories. It begins, as so many memorable tales do, not with conquest or political ambition, but with love, or at least with the sort of love that ancient dynasties often practiced, which was tangled up in duty, bloodlines, and a good deal of family politics. In the mid-4th century BCE, in the region of Caria in what is now southwestern Turkey, a ruler named Mausolus governed from his glittering capital at Halicarnassus. He was a satrap, or governor, under the sprawling Persian Empire, but he behaved more like an independent king, complete with a taste for monumental architecture and an eye for how buildings could broadcast both power and personality. Mausolus had a partner in all this, his wife, Artemisia II, who was also his sister. This was not, in their world, the eyebrow-raising arrangement it would be today. Among certain dynasties, sibling marriage was a way of keeping the royal bloodline untainted by outsiders and the family fortune neatly contained. By all surviving accounts, Artemisia was as formidable as her husband, intelligent, politically savvy, and with a flair for ceremony and symbolism. The two of them seem to have run Caria as a joint venture, commissioning new projects and refurbishing old ones, surrounding themselves with art and culture in the way that wealthy people have been doing for millennia. When Mausolus died in 353 BCE, the loss was apparently a personal as well as a political blow for Artemisia. We have no diary entries or tearful letters to confirm the depth of her grief. Such things rarely survive from antiquity. But we do have the decision she made in the wake of his death. She would build him a tomb so magnificent, so unlike anything else in the known world, that his name would never be forgotten. And here's the thing. She succeeded so completely that 2,500 years later, we still call any grand tomb a mausoleum, without necessarily remembering the man it was named for. That's an impressive legacy for a single building. The project she set in motion was breathtaking in ambition. Artemisia hired the finest architects and sculptors she could find, drawing talent from across the Greek world, Satyros and Pythias to oversee the design, and 4 of the most celebrated sculptors of the age. Scopas, Bryaxis, Timotheus, and Leocharis, to create the sculptural decoration. It's hard to overstate what a coup this was. Imagine commissioning the 4 most famous living painters you can think of and telling each to work on a separate wall of your new palace. The result, if it didn't descend into artistic chaos, would be a showcase of the era's best talent. The mausoleum's design was a kind of architectural fusion, blending Greek, Egyptian, and Lycian elements into something that had never been seen before. The rectangular base rose in stepped stages, ringed by a colonnade of Ionic columns. Above the colonnade sat a tiered, pyramidal roof, steeply angled and culminating in a colossal marble statue of Mausolus and Artemisia riding together in a 4-horse chariot. The whole structure stood roughly 45 meters, 148 feet, high, dominating the Halicarnassian skyline and gleaming in the Aegean sun. From a distance, it must have looked less like a tomb and more like the ceremonial heart of a city, part temple, part palace, part monument. The sculpture was as lavish as the architecture. The friezes that ran around the building depicted great battles, Greek warriors clashing with Amazons, centaurs grappling with lapiths, mythological scenes that were both symbolic and a little boastful, implying that Mausolus, in death as in life, belonged in the company of heroes. Between the columns stood freestanding statues, and on the roofline, carved lions kept watch. Every surface that could bear ornament seemed to have been touched by a master's hand. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a stage set for immortality. There is one detail, recorded by ancient writers, that gives the whole project a strange and slightly morbid intimacy. Artemisia, they tell us, was so grief-stricken that she ordered some of her husband's ashes to be mixed into a drink, possibly wine, possibly something more ceremonial, and drank it. Whether this was an act of devotion, a symbolic uniting of their bodies, or simply the kind of grand gesture one makes when trying to live up to the standards of Greek tragedy, we can't say. What we can say is that it cemented her reputation as a woman whose grief was matched only by her capacity for dramatic public statements. And when you've just commissioned the largest, most elaborate tomb in the known world, that's saying something. The mausoleum was not a hurried project. Artemisia didn't cut corners or rush the work. She gave her artisans the time and resources to create something exceptional. The result was a building that not only served its immediate purpose, to house Mausolus's remains and honor his memory, but also impressed itself on the imagination of everyone who saw it. Travelers wrote of its splendor, its harmonious proportions, and the way its sculpture and architecture seemed to be in perfect balance. It stood as a monument to a single man and a single woman, but also as a testament to the heights human craftsmanship could reach when unencumbered by budget constraints or modesty. In the end, Artemisia herself didn't live long to enjoy her creation. She died only a couple of years after Mausolus, and it's thought she was buried in the tomb alongside him. The mausoleum became their shared resting place, as much a memorial to her devotion as to his rule. And so it stood, gleaming in the sun, its marble chariot forever poised above the rooftops of Halicarnassus, the kind of thing that made even seasoned travelers stop and take a slow, appreciative breath before moving on. For something built to defy the centuries, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus had a remarkably good run. Longer, in fact, than almost any other wonder except the Great Pyramid. It stood for well over 1,600 years, a span so vast that by the time it finally came apart, most of the world had forgotten who Mausolus was, never mind why he merited such an extraordinary tomb. In that time, it watched over the city as the Persian Empire collapsed, As Alexander the Great swept through, as Rome rose and fell, as Byzantium took over, and as medieval kingdoms squabbled and shifted along the Anatolian coast. Whole languages died out, dynasties came and went, and the mausoleum just kept on standing there, a white marble sentinel above the harbour, its chariot team frozen in mid-gallop for more than a millennium. And then, inevitably, the earth moved. The Aegean and Anatolian coasts have never been strangers to earthquakes. They are perched on a complex and somewhat bad-tempered intersection of tectonic plates that occasionally remind the locals of their existence with a violent shrug. Sometime between the 12th and early 15th centuries, a series of quakes began nibbling away at the mausoleum's integrity. Perhaps a column leaned here, a carved frieze slipped there, a section of the roofline shifted just enough to make the whole structure slightly less secure. These were not the sort of grand, cataclysmic earthquakes that topple entire cities in a single minute, but the slow attrition of multiple events, each one a little more damaging than the last. It's worth pausing to picture this stage of its life. The mausoleum had likely already lost some of its crisp definition, the marble weathered and smoothed by centuries of wind, the once bright carvings dulled, perhaps even pitted with lichen. The gardens and courtyards around it might have been overgrown or encroached upon by other buildings, but the core structure, the colonnade and roof and crowning chariot, still held together. People in the city must have walked past it daily without giving it much thought, as we do with any ancient landmark that has always been there. Its very longevity probably made it feel indestructible. And then came the Knights. In 1402, the Knights Hospitaller, an order of crusading monks who, when not engaged in piety, were often up to their elbows in fortifications, took control of the area. They were based on the island of Rhodes, but kept a wary eye on the mainland, where the Ottoman Turks were extending their reach. Bodrum, as Halicarnassus was by then known, offered a strategic location for a fortress, and the knights set about constructing one, the Castle of St. Peter. The problem was materials. You can quarry fresh stone, which is slow and expensive, or you can look around for something already carved, dressed, and conveniently lying about. And there, right on the hillside, was one of the most famous buildings in antiquity, no longer serving its original purpose, partially damaged by earthquakes, and containing more high-quality marble than the knights could possibly hope to quarry in a decade. So they did what pragmatic builders have always done. They took it apart. In what must have been a surreal process, this monument to a long-dead Carian ruler was gradually stripped of its stones, which were ferried down the hill and incorporated into the castle walls. Some of the finer sculptural pieces were used whole, embedded into towers and ramparts like decorative trophies. Others were smashed into lime for mortar. The chariot statue that had once crowned the mausoleum was hauled away, and its fragments later turned up in the castle grounds. In a strange way, the mausoleum didn't vanish so much as it migrated, reassembling itself in another form. Even today, if you walk the walls of Bodrum Castle, you can spot blocks with the telltale smooth finish or decorative carving that clearly did not begin life as medieval fortification. By the time the 15th century ended, there was almost nothing of the mausoleum left standing on its original site. Whatever remained above ground was likely pulled down in subsequent years, scavenged by locals for use in houses, shops, or even animal pens. The site itself faded from memory. Without the commanding marble edifice to mark it, the hill became just another patch of ground in a city that had seen too much history to catalogue. By the Ottoman period, Halicarnassus's most famous landmark had passed into the hazy realm of legend, known from ancient texts, perhaps whispered about by a few antiquarians, but with no obvious trace to point to. It wasn't until the mid-19th century when Europe's fascination with antiquity was at full tilt, that anyone went looking seriously for it. The man who eventually found it was Charles Newton, a British archaeologist with the British Museum, whose determination to locate the mausoleum bordered on the quixotic. In the 1850s, Newton arrived in Bodrum armed with little more than a vague idea of where the tomb might have stood, and a passionate conviction that it was there somewhere. He had to work in a politically delicate environment, negotiating with Ottoman officials, and in an era when archaeology often involved a lot of educated guessing and more than a little luck. Newton's search was not an instant success. At one point, he bought up parcels of land on a hunch, simply to secure the right to dig. The locals must have been baffled at the sight of this determined Englishman buying perfectly serviceable gardens and orchards, then setting men to work dismantling them in pursuit of a 2,000-year-old ghost. But his persistence paid off. In 1857, he uncovered sections of the mausoleum's foundation, and more thrillingly, fragments of its sculptures. Marble lions, relief panels depicting warriors and horsemen, colossal statues thought to represent Mausolus and Artemisia themselves. These finds, in the spirit of 19th century archaeology, were carefully packed up and shipped back to London, where they became some of the British Museum's prized possessions. Standing in the museum today, you can see the fragments up close. The powerful, square-jawed head of Mausolus, the flowing drapery of a goddess figure, the remains of the famous quadriga. They are astonishing pieces, but they also feel oddly dislocated, stripped of the context that would let you feel the full sweep of the building they once adorned. The site in Bodrum is quieter, excavated and partially reconstructed in the decades since Newton's time. It offers the visitor a sun-bleached rectangle of stone foundations, scattered column drums, and a few reconstructed walls. The imagination has to work hard here, picturing the soaring colonnade, the intricate sculptures, the marble chariot high above. Yet there's something oddly fitting about its present state. The mausoleum's physical form may be fragmented, scattered across continents, but its influence lingers everywhere we use the word mausoleum. Everywhere we build something a little too grand for its purpose because we want to leave a mark. Artemisia's tribute to Mausolus has long outlived its marble and stone. It survives in the idea that love, or at least the desire to be remembered, can be made permanent in architecture. The people of Rhodes, in the late 4th century BCE, must have felt rather pleased with themselves. Their city, perched on the northeastern tip of the island, with its harbours cradled between rocky headlands, was rich, bustling, and for the moment, gloriously free. This was no small thing. Only a few years earlier, Rhodes had been besieged by Demetrius Poliorcetes, Demetrius the Besieger, a man whose military nickname gives you a fair idea of how he liked to spend his free time. His siege of the city in 305 BCE was a massive undertaking. Ships blocking the harbour, siege towers of improbable size, including one called the Helepolis, or City Taker, which must have seemed worryingly self-assured, and an army bent on bending Rhodes to his will. And yet somehow, the Rhodians held him off. They endured months of attacks, counterattacks, and the steady thud of stones from siege engines, until finally Demetrius packed up his toys and sailed away. In the aftermath, the Rhodians did what many proud, victorious cities have done throughout history. They looked for a way to commemorate their survival in the grandest possible fashion. Some cities might settle for a victory column or a triumphal arch. Rhodes decided on a giant statue, not just big, but colossal, and so they turned to Helios, the sun god, their patron deity. Helios was a natural choice. His bright, watchful presence was said to have guided them through the siege. And besides, As gods go, he was visually striking, the sort of figure you could imagine dominating a skyline. The commission fell to Charis of Lindos, a Rhodian sculptor who had trained under Lysippus, one of the great names of Greek sculpture. Charis was tasked with creating a figure of Helios that would be worthy of the city's pride and gratitude. A statue that would say to every passing ship, "This is Rhodes, do not mess with us." The work began around 292 BCE and took 12 years to complete, an astonishingly quick turnaround for something of its scale and complexity. Accounts of the Colossus vary, as ancient accounts are prone to do, but the most consistent details give us a statue about 33 meters, 108 feet tall, roughly the height of a 10-story building, made of bronze plates over an iron framework with a stone core for stability. The sheer logistics are enough to make your head spin. Bronze, in those days, didn't arrive in neat, pre-measured sheets. It had to be smelted, cast into curved plates, and hammered into place, each piece carefully fitted to the internal supports. The metal was almost certainly recycled from the weapons and siege equipment left behind by Demetrius, an inspired bit of poetic justice, turning tools of war into an emblem of peace and resilience. The Colossus's exact pose has been the subject of centuries of cheerful speculation. Medieval artists love to imagine him straddling the harbour entrance, one sandaled foot on each side, with ships passing beneath him like ants. This is almost certainly impossible. The engineering alone would have been absurdly impractical. But it is a hard image to shake once you've seen it. More likely, he stood on a promontory or quay, perhaps shading his eyes with one hand as he gazed toward the horizon, or holding a torch or spear aloft. However he was posed, his presence must have been extraordinary. Imagine approaching Rhodes from the sea, the sun glittering off a giant bronze god, his form slowly resolving from a shimmer into something tangible as your ship drew nearer. Helios was more than just a decorative flourish. In a world where reputation mattered almost as much as fortifications, the Colossus was a statement of confidence. It said, "We survived the besieger, we built this, and we are not afraid of you." It was also a source of local pride, a reminder to the Rhodians themselves that they were not merely surviving, but thriving. Festivals were held in Helios's honor, sacrifices were offered, and the statue became a focal point for civic life, looming over the city as a daily reminder of what could be achieved with unity, skill, and just a touch of audacity. For 12 years of construction and 54 years of standing tall, the Colossus was exactly what the Rhodians had hoped for, an awe-inspiring beacon of their city's power and resilience. It must have seemed in those years as permanent as the hills that framed the harbour, which, of course, is the dangerous assumption people always make about their greatest achievements. For 54 years, the Colossus of Rhodes did exactly what the Rhodians had intended it to do. It stood there looking magnificent, glinting in the sunlight, impressing visitors, and making the locals feel quietly smug every time they glanced toward the harbour. It is hard to overstate how rare that is. Most monuments get taken for granted surprisingly quickly. After a few years, even the most dazzling cathedral becomes just the big church at the end of the street. But the Colossus was so vast, so unlikely, so physically present, that it never really faded into the background. It was the kind of thing you noticed whether you meant to or not. You could be lugging amphorae of wine along the quay, deep in conversation about nothing more interesting than the price of olives, and still find yourself stealing a glance upward, as if to make sure Helios was still there. And then, quite suddenly, he wasn't. The year was 226 BCE, and Rhodes, which had survived wars and sieges and the usual swirl of Mediterranean politics, was brought low by something no amount of civic pride could prevent: an earthquake. The island sits uncomfortably close to several fault lines, and from time to time, the ground simply decides to have a dramatic moment. Contemporary writers tell us the quake was strong enough to damage much of the city, and the Colossus, despite its massive stone core and sturdy iron framework, was not spared. Somewhere around the knees, the structure gave way. Perhaps the metal supports twisted under the shock, or a stone pivot cracked, or the bronze sheathing warped and tore. However it happened, the result was abrupt and irreversible. The mighty sun god toppled. It must have been an extraordinary, if heart-wrenching sight. Imagine the groan of stressed metal, the thunder of bronze and stone cascading onto the docks or into the shallows, the clouds of dust and the sudden silence afterward. A statue that had taken 12 years to create, that had stood taller than any other bronze figure in the ancient world, was reduced in seconds to a ruin. And yet, curiously, the Rhodians didn't try to put him back together. They consulted an oracle, always a good way to defer responsibility for a difficult decision, and the oracle advised against rebuilding. Whether that was for religious reasons, the god clearly doesn't want it. Practical ones, you can't afford this again, or a mix of both, we don't know. What we do know is that the Colossus remained exactly where it fell. And here's the wonderful thing. Even in ruin, it continued to be a wonder. Ancient travelers wrote about the fallen Helios with as much awe as the standing one. The fragments were so large that a man could wrap his arms around one of the statue's thumbs and barely meet his own fingers. The bronze plates, now lying at odd angles, were still finely worked, the details of the hair and robes crisp despite the calamity. The sight must have been a peculiar combination of grandeur and melancholy, like walking through the ribs of a great shipwreck or standing beneath a tree that had been felled by lightning. The god had fallen, but his scale was still overwhelming, his presence undiminished by his change in posture. For the next 9 centuries, the ruins of the Colossus lay undisturbed. Roads carried on, its harbour still busy, its people still proud. The toppled statue became part of the city's identity, an object of curiosity for visitors who came to marvel not just at the craftsmanship, but at the sheer stubbornness of the thing, which, even in pieces, refused to vanish. Children must have grown up playing hide-and-seek among the shattered bronze plates. Merchants probably used chunks of the statue as convenient landmarks when giving directions. The Rhodians, pragmatic as ever, saw no reason to move the remains. They were heavy, impressive, and, in their own strange way, still doing the job of attracting attention. It wasn't until the year 654 CE that the Colossus truly disappeared from Rhodes. That was when Arab forces, under the general Muawiyah, captured the city. By then, the fallen god had been lying there for so long that he had almost become part of the landscape. The conquerors, however, saw in the broken statue not a sentimental relic, but a resource. Bronze was valuable, easy to melt down and repurpose, and here was an enormous stockpile of it, conveniently collected in one place. According to later chroniclers, who may have been indulging in a little hyperbole, but who can resist such a detail, the bronze was sold to a merchant from Syria who carted it away on the backs of 900 camels. 900 camels. Even allowing for the fact that medieval writers loved big, round numbers, it's a logistical image worth savouring. A long, swaying caravan plodding away from the sea, each camel laden with a gleaming curl of the sun god's skin. And then, nothing. The bronze was melted down, the stone and iron framework discarded, and the Colossus ceased to exist in any physical sense. No fragments survive in museums. No stray pieces turn up in seaside excavations. What was once the largest bronze statue on Earth simply evaporated into the past, leaving behind only its reputation and a single resonant adjective: colossal. We still use the word, without always remembering its origin, to describe anything impressively large: buildings, blunders, egos. That's the peculiar afterlife of Helios, to have his physical body obliterated, but his name live on in every giant thing we talk about. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. The Colossus was never really about the bronze or the engineering. It was about scale, about the audacity of building something that made people stop in their tracks. That sense of audacity survives, even if the statue itself does not. You can still go to Rhodes today and stand by the harbour where he is said to have stood, and even without a single scrap of him remaining, you can feel it. That little jolt of recognition that here, once, was something immense. There are certain places in history that seem to have been designed for the express purpose of making the rest of the world jealous, and ancient Alexandria was one of them. You could sail into the city's great harbour from almost anywhere in the Mediterranean and feel, in the first half hour, that you were somewhere at the centre of things. The air was scented with spices and fresh bread. Ships of every conceivable shape and size were moored along the quays, their sails still warm from the sun. Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, and a dozen other languages mingled in the market chatter. Scholars hurried between lecture halls. Priests shuffled to and from temples. Goldsmiths, glassmakers, and moneylenders all did brisk business in the same streets. And dominating it all, literally rising above every roof, wall, and mast, was the Pharos, the lighthouse that bore the name of the little island on which it stood, and which would go on to lend that name to lighthouses everywhere for the next 2,000 years. The island of Pharos sat just off the coast of Alexandria, joined to the mainland by a causeway so practical and so obvious that one suspects it was conceived before anyone even considered the finer details of the lighthouse itself. The city's founder, Alexander the Great, had chosen the site in 331 BCE for its position, a flat stretch of Egyptian coast with deep, sheltered waters, perfectly situated for trade between the Mediterranean and the Nile's vast inland reach. After Alexander's death, the city became the jewel in the crown of his general Ptolemy and his successors, and it quickly developed a problem that every ambitious port city eventually faces: how to make sure ships could find the place without running aground on their way in. The solution was both sensible and spectacular. Around 280 BCE, under Ptolemy II, construction began on a lighthouse so large and so conspicuous that no sailor within dozens of miles could plausibly claim to have missed it. The man in charge, according to later sources, was an architect named Sostratus of Cnidus, whose name, unusually for a builder, was carved into the stone, perhaps because even the Ptolemies understood that if you've just created the tallest building in the known world, you deserve a little credit. And tall it was. Estimates vary, but the best guesses put its height somewhere between 100 and 130 meters, 330 to 430 feet. Even the low end of that range would have made it a staggering achievement for its time, roughly equivalent in stature to a modern 40-story building. The Pharos was built in 3 distinct stages, each one tapering slightly as it rose, giving the whole structure a sort of monumental elegance rather than the squat bulkiness of most towers. The base was square, broad and sturdy enough to shrug off the battering of waves and wind. Above that was an octagonal section, slightly narrower, which in turn supported a cylindrical upper tier. At the very top, open to the sky, was the business end, a great brazier where a fire was kept burning through the night. Behind it, polished bronze mirrors, or possibly a series of angled reflective surfaces, caught and focused the firelight into a visible beam, which, if the ancient writers are to be believed, could be seen from 30 miles out to sea. Whether that figure is entirely accurate is open to debate. Ancient distances tend to be as much a matter of poetic license as of measurement. But there is no doubt that for sailors approaching the Egyptian coast, the Pharos would have been the first and most welcome sight. By day, the tower was just as effective. Its pale limestone blocks reflected the sun so brightly that it could serve as a daytime beacon, a kind of monumental "you're here" pin on the map. It's worth remembering that most ships of the time hugged coastlines whenever possible. Open sea navigation was difficult, risky, and heavily dependent on the goodwill of the weather. To have a fixed point like the Pharos, guiding you safely into one of the busiest and richest ports in the world, was an innovation of enormous practical value. It reduced the number of ships wrecked on the sandbanks that guarded Alexandria's approaches, sped up commerce, and cemented the city's reputation as a place that was not only wealthy, but also, in a very literal sense, enlightened. But the Pharos wasn't just a piece of infrastructure. It was a symbol. It told you, in no uncertain terms, that Alexandria was a city of serious ambition. This was a place that had the world's most famous library, a university that attracted scholars from as far away as India and Spain, and a ruler who could commission the tallest man-made structure on Earth purely for the convenience of visiting traders. To build a lighthouse of such size and complexity was to declare without saying a word, "We are at the center of the world, and we intend to stay here." Even in its functional role, the Pharos carried a touch of grandeur. The uppermost platform is said to have been crowned by a statue, probably of Zeus or Poseidon, as if the gods themselves were presiding over the comings and goings of every ship. For the sailors who relied on it, the Pharos must have felt almost like a living presence. Imagine it. After weeks at sea, perhaps with supplies running low, and the crew fraying at the edges, the horizon begins to shimmer. Then, as the day fades into night, a steady light appears in the distance. Unlike the flickering of any campfire or the stars overhead, it is fixed, unwavering, impossibly high. You know at once that it is Alexandria, and that safety, and fresh water, and bread, and a decent place to sleep is close at hand. In that moment, the Pharos was more than a lighthouse. It was hope made visible. The most frustrating thing about the Pharos is how it lasted for so long, and yet still managed to slip away without leaving us anything like the ruins it deserved. For more than a millennium, think about that, the better part of 14 centuries, the lighthouse did exactly what it was built to do. It guided ships, it impressed visitors, it stood against wind, salt, and time. Even the city around it changed several times over. The Ptolemies gave way to the Romans, who gave way to the Byzantines, who yielded to the early Islamic rulers of Egypt. Dynasties rose and fell, but the Pharos kept its lonely vigil over the harbour, looking as permanent as the horizon. And then the earth began to misbehave. The first blow seems to have come in the 10th century, when a major earthquake rattled the eastern Mediterranean. The sources, frustratingly vague as they often are, suggest that the upper tier of the lighthouse may have suffered damage, perhaps losing its statue or part of its cylindrical top. Repairs were made. Alexandria was still an important port, and no one could afford to let the city's great beacon go dark. But the building's structural integrity was never quite the same again. Still, the Pharos soldiered on. Another quake in the mid-14th century, however, was less forgiving. This one, recorded in 1303, struck with such force that it damaged not only the Pharos, but much of Alexandria. Chroniclers wrote of collapsed walls, ruined mosques, and ships driven ashore by the chaos in the harbour. The lighthouse, by then over 1,000 years old, lost a substantial portion of its upper sections. To make matters worse, only 20 years later, in 1323, another severe quake hit the city. Imagine the scene. A structure that had been the tallest man-made thing on Earth for centuries, already battered and diminished, now jolted again by the grinding of tectonic plates. By this point, the Pharos was less a proud three-tiered tower and more a battered relic, its original elegance reduced to a weathered stump of pale limestone. The great brazier, long gone. The bronze mirrors, if they had survived this long, probably smashed or looted. Even so, the lower sections still stood, stubbornly holding their ground against the sea. For decades afterward, mariners still used what was left as a landmark, though it was more for recognizing the coastline than for any actual beam of light. And then came the slow fade. By the 15th century, travelers spoke of the Pharos not as a functioning lighthouse, but as a ruin, still impressive in its bulk, but stripped of purpose, its stones weathered and fractured, its once carefully dressed blocks gaping with cracks. Salt spray gnawed at the foundations, plants rooted themselves in the crevices. Local builders began to do what local builders always do when faced with an abandoned pile of premium quality stone. They helped themselves. Piece by piece, the Pharos was quarried for other projects. Eventually, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay ordered a fortress to be built on the site, recycling much of the old lighthouse's stone. The fortress still stands today, a handsome if rather squat structure, its pale walls whispering faintly of their grander past. That's the part that always catches me. The knowledge that when you walk around the citadel of Qaitbay today, you are, in a sense, running your hands over the very stones that once climbed skyward in the shape of the pharaohs. They've simply been shuffled around, repurposed, given a new job. There's something faintly melancholy about it, like meeting an old actor in the street and realizing he's now working as a tour guide. Still interesting, still possessed of a certain dignity, but no longer playing the role that made him famous. The truly tantalizing thing is how much of the pharaohs might still be down there, under the water. In the 1990s, a team of underwater archaeologists mapping the seabed off Alexandria's coast began finding enormous blocks of stone and massive statues lying in the shallows. Some are clearly of Ptolemaic origin, carved in the distinctive style of the period. Others are unadorned but monumental, likely part of the lighthouse's foundations or upper tiers. These fragments suggest that when the great quakes came, parts of the Pharos didn't just crumble, they plunged wholesale into the harbour. And there they have remained, undisturbed except for the curious fish and the occasional scuba diver, like a kind of underwater attic filled with the dismantled pieces of a wonder. It's tempting to think of these ruins as sleeping, as if the Pharos itself were biding its time. But the reality is probably less poetic. Stone underwater doesn't rot, and Alexandria's harbour, though busy, has pockets where the currents are gentle enough to preserve things for centuries. The blocks are too massive to recover easily, and in any case, bringing them up would mean removing them from the exact place where they've been since they fell. For now, the Egyptian authorities seem content to leave them where they are, and perhaps that's the best possible choice. The Pharos, after all, has always belonged to the sea as much as to the land. Even without the tower, its legacy is absurdly secure. Every modern lighthouse owes a conceptual debt to the Pharos. In dozens of languages, the very word for lighthouse derives from it. Fair in French, pharaoh in Italian and Spanish, pharaohs in Greek. Its design influenced centuries of coastal architecture, and its reputation as one of the seven wonders gave it a place in the collective imagination that no earthquake could erase. The Pharos may have gone dark long ago, but in the truest sense, its light never went out. When you begin to look at the seven wonders together, not as separate curiosities in separate places, but as pieces of a single sprawling human impulse, you start to see a kind of narrative emerge. It is not the neat, tidy narrative that historians like to put into diagrams, but something messier and far more interesting. A story about what people will do, almost instinctively, when given the means, the resources, and just a little too much confidence. They build things. And not just useful things, bridges, wells, marketplaces, but great, improbable, frankly excessive things, the sort of projects that make visitors stop in their tracks and say, "Good heavens, who thought of that?" The first thread is ambition, and it runs through every one of the wonders like a seam. The Great Pyramid of Giza was never just a tomb. It was a statement, a deliberate defiance of scale that said, "We will not be forgotten." The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, assuming they existed in the form described, were as much a display of technical bravado as they were a private pleasure. Who else, in a sun-baked city of mud brick, would have the audacity to build a tiered mountain dripping with greenery? The statue of Zeus at Olympia was less about sheltering worshippers and more about making them feel the presence of the god so vividly that they would leave the temple awed, maybe even a little frightened. And so it goes, through Artemis's vast temple, Mausolus's extravagant tomb, the striding or gazing colossus, and the lofty seaward beam of the Pharos, each one a product of people deciding in effect to see how far they could push the limits of what stone, bronze, and human will could do. The second thread is fragility, which is almost comically at odds with the first. For all their size and swagger, the wonders were astonishingly mortal. You see it again and again in their stories: the sudden ruin of an earthquake, the slow gnawing of fire, the indignity of being carted away in pieces to serve some more modest purpose. We tend to think of stone and bronze as eternal materials, but eternity is a far shorter span when you measure it in centuries of political turnover, shifting economies, and tectonic tantrums. The Temple of Artemis burned twice. The first time at the hands of a man so desperate for fame that he committed arson just to get his name into the record books. The Colossus of Rhodes survived only a few decades before the earth shook it to its knees. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus endured for centuries, but eventually succumbed to the combined efforts of weather and medieval stone thieves. And yet, and this is the delightful part, every one of them managed to leave behind a kind of echo, some memory of itself so potent that it could survive even when the object was gone. This brings us to the third thread: storytelling. You cannot have wonders without the stories that keep them alive after their materials have vanished. Without the writers who catalogued and described them: Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, Philo of Byzantium. They would be as invisible to us as the grandest palace in a lost city buried under a desert. The wonders exist now as much in the imagination as they ever did in stone and timber, and the imagination, being what it is, has embroidered and embellished them over the centuries. That's why we still see illustrations of the Colossus straddling the harbour, an impossible feat of engineering, yes, but a hard image to shake once it's lodged in your mind. It's why the Hanging Gardens persist in every retelling as a lush, impossibly green oasis, even though not a single brick of them has been definitively identified. Stories do not require physical proof to be convincing. They only require the repeated agreement of listeners, and the wonders have had more than 2,000 years of agreeable listeners. there's also a quieter, more personal thread: the sheer human desire to be remembered. Strip away the grandeur, the politics, the religious devotion, and what you find is an urge that has not changed since the first person carved a spiral into a rock wall. These buildings and statues were, in their own ways, memorials, not just to gods or rulers, but to the capabilities of the people who made them. They were saying, in the most visible way possible, "We were here, and look what we could do." That sentiment is as present in the foundation stones of the Lighthouse of Alexandria as it is in the perfectly fitted blocks of the Great Pyramid, as alive in the carved reliefs of the mausoleum, as in the shimmering gold and ivory of Zeus's statue. And the funny thing is, it worked. Even the wonders that have been gone for more than 1,000 years still achieve the goal. We know the names of the builders: Chares of Lindos, Sostratus of Cnidus, Phidias, because they dared to put something in the world so big, so strange, so unmistakable that it demanded to be talked about. Perhaps the most satisfying thing about viewing the seven wonders together is that they remind us of a peculiar truth. Permanence is not the same as longevity. None of the wonders, save for the pyramid, have physically endured. Yet, in another sense, they have all lasted far longer than their builders could have hoped. They have lasted in our minds, in our books, in our language. Colossal, mausoleum, even pharaohs are all gifts of these vanished marvels. Their stones may have been tumbled and reused, their bronze melted down and hammered into tools, but the idea of them remains undamaged, as solid and unyielding as the day they were completed. One of the most peculiar things about the seven wonders is how much of what we know about them is, to put it politely, the result of accumulated hearsay. The wonders were described by travelers, envoys, court flatterers, and in some cases, people who almost certainly never laid eyes on them at all. The trouble is, in the ancient world, this was standard practice. If a merchant from Athens heard from a Phoenician trader that the statue of Zeus at Olympia was so tall that its head nearly touched the temple roof, and that Phoenician had heard it from a Corinthian sailor who had overheard it from a man in a tavern who had once served wine to a mason who worked on the scaffolding, then, well, that was considered a perfectly sound basis for passing the story along as fact. Accuracy was nice when it happened, but a good mental picture was worth more than any tedious precision. The result is that memory, for the wonders, has functioned less like a carefully preserved museum exhibit and more like a patchwork quilt, stitched together over centuries from whatever scraps survived. First-hand accounts, travelers' exaggerations, garbled translations, and the occasional archaeological discovery that sends everyone scrambling to update their drawings. The Hanging Gardens are the clearest example. We have no concrete archaeological proof of their existence in Babylon, yet the mental image of terraced greenery spilling with flowers over sun-baked walls is so firmly rooted in the collective mind that it feels almost absurd to question it. If someone told you tomorrow that they had found definitive evidence that the gardens were actually in Nineveh, or that they were not hanging at all but simply built on a series of balconies, it would be interesting, yes, but it would not erase the picture you already have in your head. That picture is too well set, too stubborn to be replaced by something as dull as reality. It's this stubbornness of memory that makes the wonders so fascinating. They survive not because of their physical presence, 6 of them have been gone for centuries, but because they've embedded themselves in our sense of what ancient civilization was. They form a sort of greatest hits album for antiquity. The Great Pyramid is the baseline, solid, unchanging, foundational. The Colossus is the brass section, loud, short-lived, impossible to ignore. The Temple of Artemis and the Mausoleum are the orchestral swell, grand and elaborate, heavy on the decorative flourishes. The Pharos is the clarion call, practical but elevated into poetry. Even the Hanging Gardens, which may be more myth than masonry, are the lilting, dreamlike refrain. Together, they make a composition that we've been humming for over 2 millennia, long after most of the instruments have been put away. And this is the strange fate of memory. It can outlast the very things it is supposed to record, but it rarely does so unchanged. The wonders have been edited, re-illustrated, resized, reimagined hundreds of times. Medieval artists drew the Colossus with the face of a European knight and legs like a ballerina's. Early modern engravers put in probably Gothic touches on the Pharos. Romantic painters gave the Hanging Gardens waterfalls that would have required a pumping system worthy of the Hoover Dam. In each case, the artist wasn't trying to deceive. They were simply filling in the blanks with what they knew, which was often more about their own time than about the ancient world. The wonders became, in this way, mirrors as much as windows. Each era saw itself in them and adjusted their image accordingly. Of course, there is something perversely charming about the fact that the 7 wonders, supposedly the most remarkable man-made objects of antiquity, are, in 6 cases, things that no living person has actually seen intact. We talk about them with a kind of comfortable certainty, as if we had holiday snaps from Rhodes or Halicarnassus tucked in a drawer somewhere. But our familiarity comes almost entirely from second-hand accounts and artistic invention. It's a bit like claiming to know a city because you've read its Wikipedia entry and looked at some tourist posters. You get the gist, but the details have been polished beyond recognition. And yet, for the wonders, this polishes the point. They are not just history. They are an ongoing collaboration between fact and imagination, a story that every generation retells with its own embellishments. This process has consequences. The more a wonder exists in the realm of imagination, the more it becomes untethered from practical reality. The Pharos is always drawn as pristine, shining white, its mirrors gleaming, its fire eternally bright, though in truth it would have been stained with soot, streaked with salt, and constantly in need of repair. The mausoleum is depicted with perfect symmetrical gardens, though real Mediterranean weather would have given those gardens a hard time. And the Colossus is forever straddling the harbour, an engineering impossibility, not because anyone in antiquity actually claimed it did so, but because Renaissance artists found the image irresistible, and we've collectively refused to let it go. We prefer the better story, even when it makes less sense. And this may be the ultimate irony of the 7 wonders, that their greatest survival strategy has been to become only partially real. A building or statue in its full material form can be burned, toppled, looted, or worn away by centuries of wind and rain. But an image, an idea, can outlast all of that. The physical Hanging Gardens may never have existed in Babylon, but the idea of them is thriving, immortal. The Colossus has been gone for more than 2,000 years, but the word colossal still carries its echo every time we use it. The Pharos is long since gone from the shore of Alexandria, but its name has lit the vocabulary of a dozen languages. It is tempting, looking at this strange interplay between ruin and remembrance, to think that the 7 wonders were never meant to last in stone. Perhaps their builders wanted permanence, yes, but in the end, they achieved something better. They became symbols. Symbols don't corrode. They don't topple in earthquakes. They don't get disassembled by opportunistic medieval builders looking for materials. They survive in the same way myths survive, changing shape when needed, yet always recognizably themselves. And that in the very long run, may be the most enduring wonder of all. The most remarkable thing about the Seven Wonders is not that they were built, but that they have persisted. Persisted in the sense that they are still alive in conversation, in imagination, and in language, despite the awkward fact that 6 of them are gone. It is a little like finding that your family still talks, with fondness and great detail, about a favorite seaside holiday cottage that burned down before you were born, complete with debates about how the tea always tasted better there and how the steps creaked in a certain comforting way. In the modern world, the wonders exist less as destinations than as cultural furniture, objects so firmly lodged in our shared awareness that we no longer remember putting them there. Take, for instance, the way their names have slipped quietly into our everyday vocabulary. The lighthouse of Alexandria was called the Pharos from the little island it stood on, and now fair in French and Pharaoh in Italian mean any lighthouse at all. Mausoleum comes directly from the tomb of Marcellus, and we use it unthinkingly to describe any grand burial place, even if the original was demolished centuries ago. Colossal is from the Colossus of Rhodes, and has been applied to everything from football stadiums to chocolate sundaes without a moment's thought about the lost bronze giant it once described. It is a curious kind of immortality, less about the survival of stone or bronze, more about the quiet seepage of memory into language, where it becomes so familiar we forget its origin. In the 19th century, when archaeologists and historians began to rediscover some of the old sites with anything approaching scientific accuracy, the wonders took on a second life as objects of competitive scholarship. The Victorians, with their boundless enthusiasm for classifying and ranking things, adored them. Here was a list you could argue about endlessly: which was the largest, the most beautiful, the most technically advanced, the most tragically short-lived. They filled illustrated volumes with careful engravings based on whatever evidence was available, which often meant that an artist working in London might be tasked with drawing the Temple of Artemis, having never seen so much as a Greek column in person. These illustrations, half archaeology, half guesswork, became the public's window into the ancient world, and they were widely circulated in books, newspapers, and lecture slides. If you were a middle-class child in 1880, the chances were good that you learned the names of the 7 wonders before you knew the capitals of half the countries on your own continent. By the 20th century, the wonders had graduated from scholarly fascination to outright pop culture fixtures. They appeared in films and adventure novels, in comic books, and Saturday matinee serials. The idea of a lost wonder became a reliable hook for any story that needed a bit of ancient mystery: hidden chambers under the mausoleum, treasure maps in the foundations of the Colossus, secret scrolls preserved in the lighthouse of Alexandria before the earthquakes took it. Never mind that most of these were implausible, they were irresistible. If Indiana Jones had been given another couple of films, you can be certain he would have ended up clambering over the ruins of at least one wonder, chased by a combination of unscrupulous rival archaeologists and badly animated scorpions. In the real world, the impulse to create new wonders has never quite gone away. Modern cities, especially those with the means and the ambition to impress, still reach instinctively for the same scale and spectacle. Think of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the Sydney Opera House, the Hoover Dam. None of these is on the official ancient list, of course, but they scratch the same human itch: to build something that will be noticed, admired, and, if the builders are honest, remembered long after they are gone. UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites, with its hundreds of entries from every continent, could be seen as a democratized version of the 7 wonders, a recognition that the urge to commemorate and preserve is not limited to one part of the world or one era of history. And yet the Seven Wonders remain the gold standard of monumental achievement in the popular imagination. Other lists have been drawn up. The new Seven Wonders, chosen by global vote in 2007, for example. But the original set, with its blend of reality, myth, and sheer theatricality, still commands the most fascination. Perhaps it is because they represent a time when building something of extraordinary scale meant committing vast resources with no expectation of quick returns. A pyramid could take decades to finish. A temple might span the reigns of several rulers. These were undertakings that tested not just engineering skill, but political will and the patience of entire populations. The modern echoes are sometimes literal. In Rhodes, there have been periodic proposals to rebuild the Colossus in some modern form, usually accompanied by architectural sketches of shining steel or titanium giants straddling the harbour in a way the original never did. In Alexandria, the fort of Qaitbay stands on the site of the Pharos, and visitors still speak of seeing the lighthouse, though what they are actually seeing is a 15th century fortress. In Bodrum, Turkey, the remains of the mausoleum are carefully presented to tourists, who arrive expecting something towering and are instead met with low walls and scattered column drums. And yet no one seems to mind much. Standing on the site of a wonder, even one long gone, has its own strange satisfaction. You are touching a point where the threads of history knot together, where a place on the map becomes layered with centuries of imagination. What is perhaps most extraordinary is how the Seven Wonders have transcended their own specifics to become a shorthand for excellence. To call something a wonder today is to imply that it is the best of its kind, even if it is a plate of nachos or a new brand of vacuum cleaner. The original list was both exclusive and finite. There were 7 and only 7, but the concept has proved infinitely expandable. There are 7 wonders of the natural world, 7 wonders of the industrial world, 7 wonders of the underwater world. You can find travel articles promising the 7 wonders of a given country, city, or even neighborhood. We seem to like the number as much as the idea. It feels just large enough to be grand, but small enough to remember without resorting to a notepad. In the end, the modern life of the 7 wonders says as much about us as it does about the ancient world. We want our history to be distilled into lists, our achievements to be ranked, our ruins to come with stories that can be told in a single sitting. We like the idea that there was once a perfect catalogue of human brilliance, now scattered to the winds, and that we, in our museums and libraries and online archives, are piecing it back together. The wonders have survived because they are useful to us, not in the way the pharaohs was useful to sailors, but in the way myths are useful to cultures. They give us a sense of continuity, a reminder that people in every age have wanted to be remarkable and remembered, and that sometimes they succeeded. If there is one thing the 7 wonders prove beyond any doubt, it is that human beings have always had an appetite for leaving behind something more than their bones and broken crockery. We like permanence, or at least the illusion of it, and we have a touching faith in the idea that if you pile enough stone in the right shape, or cast enough bronze into a suitably heroic figure, you can outwit time. The people who planned the pyramids or the Temple of Artemis or the Pharos of Alexandria were not, I suspect, under any illusions about their own mortality. They knew they would never see the world as it would be in 1,000 years or even in 100. But they could imagine a time in which their creation might still stand, and in that imagined time their names, or at least the name of the thing they built, would be spoken aloud. The truth, of course, is more complicated. The physical forms of the wonders, for the most part, have not survived. A few have been erased so thoroughly that their very locations are still debated. The Hanging Gardens may have been in Babylon, or they may have been in Nineveh, or they may have been a figment of a particularly persuasive travel writer's imagination. The Colossus of Rhodes, once so spectacular that visitors were said to come from across the known world just to gawk at it, was toppled and carted away for scrap before it had even reached its 30th birthday. And yet, paradoxically, they have all endured far longer than the builders could have dared to hope, not as stone or bronze, but as ideas. It is a peculiar kind of endurance, this survival through memory. A ruin can last only so long before it is quarried, weathered, or buried. But once an object passes fully into the realm of cultural memory, it becomes strangely untouchable. You cannot chip away at the Colossus in someone's imagination. You cannot topple the Hanging Gardens in a painting. Even the most contradictory or inaccurate descriptions of the wonders have served to keep them alive, each retelling adding a new coat of varnish to the myth. The Victorians, with their love of meticulous illustration and tidy captions, gave us tidy, symmetrical visions of the wonders. Hollywood gave us sunlit marble and improbably clean togas. Video games give us scale, spectacle, and the occasional dramatic thunderstorm. Each version is different, but all point back to the same original seed. There was a time, long ago, when people built something so extraordinary that it demanded to be remembered. What's interesting is how readily we accept this patchwork of fact and fantasy. We live in an age that likes to think of itself as immune to myth-making, yet when it comes to the Seven Wonders, we're happy to indulge in a bit of creative exaggeration. We don't mind that the Colossus never straddled the harbour, because the image is too delightful to give up. We don't mind that the Hanging Gardens probably didn't look much like the cascading Eden of Victorian engravings, because it's too pleasant a picture to abandon. In a way, we treat the wonders like old family stories, half truth, half embroidery, and made better by the telling. The influence of the wonders reaches beyond art and language into how we measure achievement. The very notion of a wonder as a category owes itself to this ancient list. It is a label that conveys a kind of universal approval, an unspoken agreement that something is worth stopping for, worth looking at, worth remembering. That's why the Seven Wonders have spawned so many imitators. The Seven Natural Wonders, the Seven Underwater Wonders, the Seven Industrial Wonders, and, inevitably, the Seven Most Overrated Wonders. Compiled, no doubt, by someone convinced that Machu Picchu is just a pile of rocks, and the Grand Canyon is a bit of a hole. We keep returning to the number 7, as if it has some mystical rightness to it. Perhaps it does. 7 is just large enough to feel abundant, but small enough to remember without resorting to a notebook. There's also a comforting symmetry in the fact that the Seven Wonders were scattered across the ancient world, from the Nile to the Aegean to the banks of the Euphrates. In their day, they were the furthest flung points of the Greek-speaking world's mental map, each one a sort of punctuation mark at the edge of the known. To visit them all would have been to trace a route across the most sophisticated and powerful civilizations of the age, a kind of ultimate cultural pilgrimage. Today, that pattern feels oddly familiar. Tourists with bucket lists still pin their travels on landmarks, though now the list is more likely to include the Eiffel Tower, the Taj Mahal, or the Great Wall than the Temple of Artemis. The impulse, however, is the same: to stand in a place where greatness once stood, to feel for a moment as if you are brushing shoulders with history. In the end, the legacy of the Seven Wonders is not simply that they were beautiful or impressive or technically advanced, though they were all those things. It is that they remind us that humans have always been restless in the face of the ordinary. A functional temple would do, but a temple so large and so adorned with sculpture that it made visitors gasp was better. A lighthouse could be a squat tower with a light, but a 400-foot marble beacon with polished bronze mirrors was more satisfying. A tomb could be a modest stone chamber, but if you had the means, why not make it the most splendid monument in the world? This restless urge to create, to impress, to be remembered, is as much a part of us now as it was then. You can see it in skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, in sports arenas shaped like petals or shells, in concert halls that look like fragments of some futuristic sculpture. We still build our wonders. We just do it with steel and glass instead of marble and limestone. The most lasting legacy, though, might be in the way the seven wonders invite us to imagine. They are a bridge between what we know and what we dream. We know the pharaohs existed, but we dream of its light sweeping across a black sea. We know the mausoleum's scale, but we dream of its gardens and statuary gleaming in the sun. We know the Colossus fell, but we dream of it watching over the harbour, face to the horizon. That combination of fact and fantasy is oddly liberating. It means the wonders are not locked in the past. They can change with us, taking on new shapes in each generation's mind. And in doing so, they keep alive the oldest of human impulses, the desire to leave something behind that makes people stop, look up, and feel for a moment, very small and very lucky to have seen it at all.